For the remainder of time between Tier 3 and Tier 4, the majority of work and dedication was put towards making the Realm vs. Realm campaigns a bit more polished. RAM systems weren't always implemented, you know. You had to brute force a door open with melee at one point in the game in order to capture keeps. The team would eventually add loser rewards to RVR to improve the quality of life for campaigns. Imagine today if Prague had a 24-hour stalemate and you had no shot at getting a bag roll or bonus renown. Once the team had nailed down a solid system with the towing of rams and siege equipment, they looked next to balancing the Magus, Shamans, Engineer, Archmage. There was even an experimental mode that was implemented for a brief time. You had to type a code to select what kind of passive buffs you wanted, and this would be the precursor design for Engineer and Magus turret buffs. And, to nobody's surprise, NG and Magus would become the focus for almost the rest of the year before 2017. There was also a lot of work being done to the game code, presumably by Nathrul. A lot of the posts he would make were concerning changes to the keep systems, battlefield objectives, as well as contribution systems. 2017 would roll in some changes to counter Zergs, more quality of life fixes, minor fixes to different game systems to counter exploits, etc. While we're still on the topic of 2017, there was major gear upgrades being made. As the Conqueror and Dominator sets would be released early on in the year, so too would the chain quest to grind out Beastlord armor. This would allow for some gearing alternatives and also a big tool to utilize in 6v6 for the unique debuffs that Beastlord had. During the research I have done while combing through the archive changelogs, I noticed that Azrael's presence would slowly diminish over time. After 2017, he would slowly cease to post updates, ultimately being replaced by Wargrimnir and Nathrul for changelog postings. 2017 was a pivotal era for the server in my opinion. There was many defining moments for different types of content and areas of the game. The early months of 2017 would see Quick Escape added. This would prove especially useful for Goblin players and classes with kiting capabilities. There would also be a reversion done to the counter Zerg mechanics, which were implemented just a few months prior. I'm not really sure what the reasoning was for it. T1 would finally see a refining moment when they released this patch, which coincided with the new changes for RVR in general, listing a custom UI to show how zones would be locked, as well as a resource indicator. Doomsday Event. Doomsday Event has been the most successful piece of content added into the game by far. The name Doomsday Event has been lost to the years because the real update was far more beneficial than the name actually sounds. This patch would see RVR reach the state that it is in to this day in 2023. T2 through T4 would be merged, and that was not all. There would be multiple zones open now during RVR, which meant that the pairings could be pushed separately. The patch would also see the bolster system added into the server, which has been a part of the game to this very day. The server would also see Gunbad released on New Year's of 2017, marking the first fully functional dungeon for Tier 4 content. 2018 rolled in a change that would undoubtedly affect the player base in many different ways. X-Realm chat would finally be disabled at the beginning of 2018. Gunbad would be placed under the knife just a bit longer. They would slowly add weapons, jewelry, and lineaments to the bags from public quests, otherwise known as the dungeon bosses. There were a few other instances in which they tweaked public quests following this, but none of it was of significant scope. Around this time, the next class which fell under the eyes of balance moderators would be the White Lion. It is believed that during this time they wanted to balance the White Lion in small man situations, while also giving them some defensive capabilities and different playstyles more suitable for Warband. I honestly didn't know this, or how long it stayed in the game, but it seems like this patch would add a pet guard ability which would last for 30 seconds, which essentially just split the damage you took between a player and his line pet. About a week later, the Loner tactic would be added to White Lions, which granted the class some additional mobility, which is a helpful advantage in most situations. And that was not all. On the flip side, they would add a 30% movement speed buff to get to the chopper. This was honestly a huge buff considering today the movement speed has been bumped down to 20%. The following patch to come would feature changes to the Warrior Priest and the Disciple of Cain, shuffling some abilities around for their DPS counterparts to have a bit more synergy. If you look closely at this patch, you will notice some more White Lion changes to increase their viability in different playstyles. Train to Kill would be tweaked to scale the pet's offensive stats off of the player's defensive stats, allowing for some more avenues to character builds and playstyle. On top of this all, Dansari and Peter the Pan 3 would become balance mods for Return of Reckoning. 1 month later, RR255 would be switched on, effectively making the game unbeatable. A few weeks later, defenseless training dummies would be added to both Altdorf and Inevitable City. PvE would also have a chance to shine when the coders finally completed the Chapter 22 public quest. This would also mark the release of Onslaught armor. Torque Madra would drop a balance patch which would revolutionize the Squig Herder into what it is today. The balance patch would feature a rework to the Stabbin' Tree and Squig armor. The Horton Squig would receive an armor buff, scale with Path of Stabbin', and be granted a knockdown. Gas Squig would complement ranged builds and give a plus distance to ranged attacks. The Squig armor was the meat of the update, featuring 4 new abilities, 2 of which were AoE for melee builds. Another ability featured a leap, and an additional ability would buff the player's armor temporarily. There would also be new 13 and 15 point abilities. Tastes Like Stunty, which was a defensive base healing ability, allowed the melee Squig to have some survivability. And Out of My Way was the 15 point ability, which simply increased movement speed by 75% during this time. Nobody was safe during this balance patch though. The Black Orc would have its famous 3-hit combo, restricted to 2-hand only. Bruiser's Sword and Board Black Orcs were powerful, boasting insane block rating and a DPS ability which had a high tooltip. Couple it with You What, and it was unclear whether a Black Orc was a tank or just a really tanky DPS. While this patch might have been a bad day for some, there was even more changes to go around the room. The Blackguard community surely bustled with excitement when they received one of the craziest looking knockdown abilities I think I've ever seen on a tank. Halt Fool, a now removed ability, would knock your opponent down, slow them by 40% for 3 seconds, and also increase your movement speed by 30%. It would get even better. The Blackguard would also receive Rebounding Hatred, an ability very much akin to the Swordmaster's Wall of Darting Steel, increasing active defenses by 50% with a 2-handed weapon, which is another ability that has also been removed to this day. Let us not forget about our graceful pointy-eared friend the Shadow Warrior. They would receive Shadow Step as a gap closer, which also increased defenses by 25% as well as the player's auto attack speed. It was originally 50% across the board, but it was later decided to be tuned down. This would have been seen as a huge buff for Assault Shadow Warriors in general. It could have helped with hybrid builds, but given it was in the 15-point slot, I would like to think that it was implemented as a deep spec ability. As a side note, it's crazy to think that today in 2023, this ability is in the 5-point ability slot, and also the defenses are 10% less than what they used to be.